Alexander Bennett believed in silence. In the sharp, calculated world of high-stakes business, silence was power. It was the space between negotiations, the pause before a final offer, the quiet nod that sealed million-dollar deals. Silence, to Alexander, meant control. But the silence in his home was different. It wasn't powerful. It was heavy, stale, the kind that settled into the corners of the house like dust no one bothered to wipe away anymore. Especially in the music room. He hadn't stepped into that room in over 3 years. Not since the day after Rebecca's funeral. Her fingerprints still lingered on the piano keys in his memory, even if they'd long faded in real life. She used to play every morning, the melodies flowing through the halls like a second heartbeat. Ethan would lie on the carpeted floor and listen with closed eyes, mouthing the notes like secrets. Then the accident happened, and everything fell silent. Alexander had replaced the silence with systems, with calendars, caregivers, routines. Breakfast at 8 o'clock, physical therapy at 10 o'clock, reading time, nap time, medication. He had built a fortress of structure, hoping to shield Ethan from grief, perhaps even from memory. But grief had a way of leaking through cracks, and Ethan, despite all the scheduling, had become quieter than any room in the house. Until today, the sound stopped Alexander mid-step as he passed the hallway on his way to a call with his legal team. A piano, a single note. Not random, not a test. Intentional. Deliberate. He froze. No one was allowed in that room. The staff had strict orders. Isabella especially. She followed rules to the letter. And yet the music floated down the corridor like a whisper too bold to ignore. He turned toward the door, unsure if he was walking or being pulled by the sound. The room was dim, its tall windows veiled in linen curtains that muted the sunlight. Dust hovered in the air, shimmering like forgotten time. And there she was. Isabella, not cleaning, not folding, not invisible. She sat at the piano bench, back straight, fingers poised. Her eyes were closed, not in pretense, but in surrender. She didn't see Alexander at the door. She didn't see Ethan either, tucked in his wheelchair just to her right, watching her with something Alexander hadn't seen in his son in years. Wonder. Alexander didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. Isabella played, not like a performer, but like someone remembering how to feel. Her touch was gentle, hesitant, then slowly grew confident. The melody was unfamiliar, soft, minor, fragile. It wrapped around the room like a question with no answer. When the piece ended, Ethan exhaled audibly, as if he'd been holding his breath the entire time. So, Isabella asked gently, still not looking at Alexander, "Did you feel it?" Ethan nodded. "I felt warm," he said softly, "like when Mom used to." He didn't finish. Alexander's throat tightened. Isabella finally turned and saw him. There was no shock on her face, no guilt, only a quiet, steady acknowledgement. A silent, "I know you didn't expect this, but it's happening anyway." Alexander stepped forward, slow and controlled. "What exactly is going on here?" he asked, his voice low, tight with restrained disapproval. Isabella rose, folding her hands calmly in front of her. "We were rediscovering something," she said simply. "This room is off limits," he said. "Yes," she nodded. "And so is grief. But it comes anyway." That hit harder than it should have. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dad, I asked her to play." Alexander looked at his son. There was color in his face, a lightness in his voice. He hadn't seen it since. "Since when do you care about the piano?" Alexander asked, too sharply. Ethan winced. "Since always. I just didn't think I was allowed anymore." Silence again. Isabella broke it. "He's curious, Mr. Bennett. He asks questions about notes, rhythm, how sound moves through wood and air. He listens, not just with ears but with—" "She's a housekeeper," Alexander interrupted. "I was a pianist," she replied, calm but firm. "Long before I was anything else." Alexander's expression hardened. Then why are you here, cleaning floors instead of on some stage? Isabella looked him in the eyes, not flinching. Because life doesn't ask permission before taking things away, she said. Alexander felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at his son again. Ethan's eyes weren't pleading. They were hopeful, quietly daring his father to see what he saw. Please don't take this away from me, Ethan whispered. Alexander opened his mouth, then closed it. He couldn't bring himself to say no, not to that voice, not to his son who had barely spoken in days, weeks, months. He turned to Isabella. Teach him, but not in here. She nodded once. Of course. As she pushed Ethan gently out of the room, Alexander stayed behind. He looked at the piano. The keys were slightly worn, the ivory chipped in places. The bench still bore the faint imprint of someone who used to sit there every morning, making this house feel alive. He sat. He didn't touch the keys, but he sat there. And for the first time in years, he allowed the silence to be something else, not an absence, a beginning. Ethan Bennett had never touched a piano key before the day Isabella Reyes let him feel the sound. They didn't return to the music room. Alexander had been clear about that. Instead, Isabella set up a small keyboard in the sunroom, next to the window that overlooked the garden. It wasn't much, just 61 keys, plastic, slightly out of tune, but to Ethan, it was an open door. Isabella didn't start with scales. She didn't hand him a book, or make him sit straight or scold him for his wrist placement. She placed his hand on the keys, gently guiding his fingers like one would guide a blind man through a forest. Press, she whispered. Don't think, just feel. The first note was tentative, then another. The vibration traveled through the plastic casing, into his palm, up his arm, into his chest. He smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him. For the first week, they didn't talk much. Ethan was quiet by nature, and Isabella respected that. Instead, she let the music do the speaking. She played simple melodies, a lullaby, a folk tune, the opening bars of a Chopin nocturne, while Ethan listened with his eyes closed, his body leaning slightly toward the keys. Alexander watched from a distance. He never stepped into the room, but often stood in the hallway, just out of view. He didn't understand what was happening, but he couldn't ignore it either. His son was changing, not rapidly, not dramatically, but subtly, like the slow bloom of a flower in early spring. One afternoon, as golden light pooled across the floor, Ethan asked, "Why did you stop playing?" Isabella paused. She was wiping the keyboard with a soft cloth, a habit she hadn't shaken. Because it hurt too much, she said. Ethan didn't ask more. He just nodded. He understood that kind of silence. The next day, he showed her a melody he'd made up in his head. It was clumsy, but it had soul. Isabella listened intently, then played it back with slight variations. "You wrote this," Ethan shrugged. "I dreamed it." She smiled. "Then let's wake it up." They began composing together, a few bars at a time. Sometimes Ethan hummed ideas. Sometimes he just pressed notes until something clicked. Isabella filled in the gaps but never overstepped. She let his imagination lead. Weeks passed. The melody grew. So did Ethan. Alexander noticed. One evening at dinner, Ethan spoke about key signatures and time signatures, about how F major felt like morning and D minor felt like rain. Alexander listened, fascinated but out of his depth. "He's different," Alexander told Isabella one night as she cleared the table. "No," she said, not looking up. "He's becoming who he was always meant to be." Alexander said nothing. The truth was, it scared him, not the music, not Isabella, but the realization that he had no part in this transformation, that his son was becoming whole through someone else's guidance. One rainy afternoon, Ethan asked to play something for his father. Alexander hesitated, then nodded. Isabella rolled the keyboard into the living room. Ethan sat, hands poised, a slight tremor in his fingers. He played the piece they'd been composing. It wasn't perfect, A few wrong notes, a pause too long here and there, but it had heart. And it had him. When he finished, the room was silent. Alexander clapped once, then again. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Ethan beamed. Later that night, Alexander stood outside Isabella's quarters. "Thank you," he said. Isabella looked at him, her eyes unreadable. "Don't thank me yet." "Why not?" "Because the hard part hasn't started." Alexander didn't understand. Not yet, but he would. Alexander Bennett wasn't a man who dwelled in the past. He built walls against it, carefully and deliberately, one achievement at a time. The future was safer, predictable, shaped by strategy and control. But even the most reinforced minds have cracks, and lately his had begun to split. It started with the music. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed the sound of a piano in his home until Ethan began practicing daily. It was soft at first, uncertain, then it grew, not just in volume but in confidence. The melodies wandered down the hallways, curling under doors, stirring memories Alexander had buried so deep he no longer recognized them as his own. One night, unable to sleep, he found himself outside the sunroom. The door was cracked open, the glow from the small lamp casting long shadows on the wall. Inside, Isabella sat at the keyboard. Ethan had gone to bed. She was playing something different, not one of their compositions, something older, richer. He recognized the piece. It had been Rebecca's favorite. The realization hit him like cold water. He stepped inside. Isabella didn't stop playing. She looked up briefly, acknowledged his presence with a quiet nod, and continued. When the final note faded, she turned to him. "That was Rebecca's favorite. Moonlight Sonata," he said. Isabella nodded. "I know. Ethan told me." Alexander sat down on the window bench, the cushion sagging beneath him. "Do you miss it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I miss the version of me who could listen to it without breaking," he finally said. Isabella said nothing. She just looked at him, eyes soft, patient. After a long silence, he asked, "Why did you really stop performing?" Isabella tilted her head slightly, then turned her gaze to the keys. "There was a boy," she began. "Not a love story, not exactly. He was my student. 12 years old. Bright. Fragile. He reminded me a little of Ethan." Alexander listened, his posture stiff, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "He had a condition," she continued. "Degenerative. We both knew his time was limited, but he loved music. It was his escape, his rebellion. I taught him every day. And then one day, he didn't show up." The voice caught for a moment. She looked away, blinking slowly. "After the funeral, I couldn't touch a piano. Every time I tried, I heard his voice instead of the notes. So I left the city, the stage, my name." Alexander exhaled slowly. "And now?" he asked. Isabella smiled faintly. "Now, Ethan reminds me that music isn't about performance. It's about presence. About healing." He nodded, more to himself than to her. They sat in silence for a while. The next morning, Alexander surprised Ethan by asking about the piece they were writing. "What key is it in?" he asked over breakfast. Ethan lit up. "It started in a minor, but now it modulates into C major. Isabella says it's like stepping from a shadow into sunlight." Alexander smiled, a real one. For the first time, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own house. Later that week, Ethan invited Alexander to sit in on one of their sessions. He hesitated but agreed. He watched as Isabella guided his son through phrasing and dynamics, gently correcting posture, encouraging nuance. She was a teacher in the truest sense, not instructing but awakening. At one point, Ethan stumbled over a measure and groaned in frustration. Isabella chuckled. Even Mozart had to start somewhere. Ethan looked up. "Did you ever meet him?" She laughed, really laughed, and Alexander felt something shift in the room. It was light. It was warm. That night, Alexander sat alone in the music room. He opened the old cabinet and pulled out one of Rebecca's sheet music folders. The paper was yellowed, edges curled. He placed it on the stand, sat at the bench, and pressed a key. The sound was off. The piano was out of tune. But it didn't matter. It was a beginning. The house had changed. Not in any dramatic way. The walls were still the same pale ivory, the furniture still tastefully cold. But the air felt different, lighter, as if some long-shut window had finally opened and the dust was choosing to leave. Ethan noticed it first. He woke up one morning to find the sunlight falling a little softer across the hardwood floor. The silence of the house no longer felt like absence but possibility. Alexander, too, had started noticing things. The way Ethan smiled when he played, even when he got the notes wrong. The quiet authority in Isabella's hands when she demonstrated a phrase. The way her fingers danced across the keyboard like they still remembered every stage she'd ever stood on. And strangely, the way the music began to follow him. Into his office, into the kitchen, into the parts of him he boarded up. It wasn't always easy. Some days, Ethan would freeze halfway through a song. His hands would tremble, his confidence would flicker, and Isabella would gently place her hand over his. "It's not about perfection," she would whisper. "It's about expression. Play what you feel, not what you think you're supposed to sound like." Alexander watched those moments from the hallway. He never interrupted. He was learning too. They were writing a piece now. It had no title yet, just a name scribbled in pencil on the top of the sheet. For her. Isabella never asked who her was meant to be. She didn't need to. Some days, Ethan would bring in a new phrase, a tiny collection of notes, and Isabella would nod thoughtfully, try it out, then adjust it just slightly. "There," she'd say. "Now it breathes." Other days, Isabella would play something she'd written long ago, a forgotten melody from another life, and Ethan would add a counterpoint. Their ideas became threads in the same cloth, stitching together something neither could have made alone. Alexander began joining them more often. At first, he simply sat nearby, reading emails with one ear tilted toward the music. Then he started staying longer. One afternoon, Isabella offered him a pencil. "Your turn," she said. Alexander shook his head. "I don't compose." "You do now," Ethan said, smiling. Alexander laughed, a real surprised laugh that felt foreign in his own mouth. He scribbled a note. It was clumsy, but it was his. They played it. It stayed. And just like that, it was no longer Ethan's piece, or Isabella's, or even Alexander's. It was theirs. That night, Isabella stayed late. The air outside was crisp, the first hints of autumn curling into the edges of the evening. Alexander walked her to the door. He didn't usually. "You've done something remarkable," he said. "With him?" Isabella turned to face him. "I didn't give him anything that wasn't already inside." He nodded slowly, thoughtful. "But you helped him find it," he said. She looked down for a moment, then back up. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something older, wiser. "So did you?" she said quietly. He didn't know how to answer that, so he opened the door. And for the first time, Isabella didn't just walk out. She turned, looked at him, and said, "Alexander, the boy you're raising, he's not surviving anymore. He's beginning to live. Don't let that go." He watched her walk down the stone path, her silhouette slowly fading into the dusk. 2 days later, Ethan asked if they could record the piece. "Not for anyone else," he said. "Just for us. So we don't forget how it felt." Isabella smiled. "That's exactly why we write music." They set up a small recorder, nothing fancy. Ethan in his chair, Isabella beside him, Alexander seated just behind, out of frame, but not out of presence. Ethan began. The first note was soft, then the next. Isabella joined in, weaving her melody around his like a memory wrapping around a dream. And then came the part Alexander had written. He hadn't realized how much of himself was in those 4 bars until he heard them played aloud. They weren't perfect, but they were honest, raw, human. When the final note faded, No one spoke. The silence was sacred. Then Ethan turned, eyes wide and full. "Can we call it home?" he asked. Isabella looked to Alexander. Alexander swallowed, then nodded. "Yes," he said, "that sounds right." And it did. The first time Ethan refused to play, it wasn't out of rebellion. It was out of fear. He sat in the sunroom, the keyboard in front of him, his hands curled in his lap. Isabella waited beside him, silent but present. She knew the signs. Something had shifted. "Are you feeling unwell?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "Did you sleep okay?" A pause, then another shake. Isabella didn't press. She simply reached for the small metronome on the table and wound it. The soft ticking filled the silence like rain tapping on a window. Ethan flinched. "Turn it off," he said, his voice tight. She stopped the ticking. He looked up, and there it was, a tremor in his eyes like the surface of water after a stone's been dropped. "I dreamed of the accident," he whispered. Isabella didn't move. "She was driving me to a recital. It was raining. I kept asking her to turn the music louder, but she said no, it was too distracting. I got mad. I said I didn't want to go if I couldn't hear the song I liked." His lips trembled. "We never made it." Silence hung in the room like fog. Isabella finally spoke. "Do you think it was your fault?" He didn't answer. That was answer enough. Alexander found him hours later, curled in his chair by the window, the keyboard untouched. Isabella was in the kitchen. She looked up when Alexander entered, her face already braced for confrontation. "He remembered," she said simply. Alexander didn't need to ask what. "I should have been there," he muttered, pouring himself a glass of water he didn't drink. "I told Rebecca I had a meeting. It was a quarterly review. Nothing urgent. Nothing that mattered." Isabella studied him. "We all carry a piece of it, Alexander. That's what grief does. It splits the weight so no one person can stand." He leaned on the counter, shoulders sagging. "He thinks it's his fault." Isabella placed her hand gently on the marble. "Then you have to show him it's not. Not with words, with presence." Alexander nodded slowly, as if unlearning years of absence in that one motion. That evening, Ethan didn't want to eat. Alexander carried his tray to the sunroom anyway. He set it down beside him, not speaking, just sitting. The silence stretched. Then Ethan said, "I ruined everything." Alexander turned. "No, you didn't. You weren't there." "I know." Alexander's voice cracked. "Why weren't you?" Alexander looked down at his hands. "Because I thought I had time. I thought work mattered more than one recital. I was wrong." The boy's chin trembled. "I just wanted her to turn on the music. I didn't know it would be the last thing I ever said to her." Alexander leaned in, voice thick. "And she just wanted you to play. She told me that night before you left. He's going to shine, Alex. He just doesn't know it yet." Tears slipped down Ethan's cheeks. Alexander didn't offer a tissue. He offered his arms. And for the first time in years, Ethan let himself be held. Isabella watched from the hallway. Her hand rested on the doorframe, steadying herself against a wave of her own memories. She returned to the sunroom the next morning. Ethan was already there. "I want to play today," he said. But not alone. Isabella sat beside him. They began from the top. The piece had changed, slightly slower, a little softer, but fuller. When they reached the second movement, Isabella paused. "Would you like to add something new here?" Ethan looked up. "Can we use one of hers?" "Hers?" He nodded. "Mom's." Alexander entered the room just in time to hear the words. He was carrying a folder. "Sheet music. I thought maybe you'd ask," he said. He handed it to Ethan. Isabella unfolded the pages. Rebecca's handwriting danced across the staff lines, elegant, flowing. They played it, and it fit like it had always been waiting for its place in the song. That night, they played it once more, the whole thing from beginning to end. Alexander sat beside Ethan this time. turning the pages. Isabella played the harmony. Ethan led, and together, they filled the house with something it hadn't known in years: grace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of love despite it. The invitation was Isabella's idea. Not a grand announcement, no stage lights or velvet curtains. Just a letter, printed neatly, hand-delivered to a few neighbors, a couple of teachers, and the physical therapist who had been with Ethan since his hospital days. You are invited to an evening of music, memory, and healing featuring Ethan Bennett. Saturday at 6:00 p.m., the Bennett home, sunroom. Alexander had raised an eyebrow when he saw the draft. "He's not ready," he said. "He's not aiming for perfection," Isabella replied. "He's aiming for truth." Alexander couldn't argue with that. So the invitations went out. Ethan didn't ask who would come. He only asked for a copy of the program. Isabella made it simple. Prelude, a piece for her, original composition, movement I, shadows movement U, light movement I. Home beneath it, one line in italics. Dedicated to the quiet hearts that never stopped listening. The sunroom was cleaned until the glass glowed. Alexander brought in extra chairs. Isabella brought in flowers, not from a shop, but from her own small garden behind the guest house. White lilies, rosemary, and sprigs of lavender. Ethan wore a navy blue shirt, sleeves rolled carefully above the elbows, hair combed with nervous fingers. His chair was polished. His music was printed and placed on the stand. He looked ready, but he didn't feel it. Alexander knelt beside him a few minutes before the first guests arrived. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to stand in front of entire boardrooms full of people and still forget what I was supposed to say." Ethan looked at him. "What did you do?" "I told them the truth." Ethan nodded. The first guests arrived, then more. By 6:00, the sunroom was full, not packed, but comfortably alive. Familiar faces, curious ones, a few misty eyes, and one old man in the corner who hadn't smiled in years. Until Ethan wheeled himself forward. Alexander stood and welcomed everyone with a few short words. He thanked them for coming. He said nothing about tragedy or illness or the years lost. Only this: tonight, you will hear more than music. You will hear the sound of someone finding his voice. Then he stepped back. Isabella joined Ethan at the keys. She didn't face the audience. Her role was not the spotlight. Ethan began. The room fell into stillness. The first notes were like breath, tentative, testing, but each one carried something invisible, something lived. Shadows was not a sad piece. It was honest. The pauses between phrases held weight. The low chords hummed like memory. Then came light, faster, brighter, a lift in tempo. Isabella added harmony, delicate and sure. The melody danced now, no longer afraid to be seen. And then home. Alexander had helped shape that one. A few notes he barely remembered writing, woven now into something complete. It was a lullaby, a conversation, a welcome. When the final note faded, the silence returned. But it was not empty. It was full of the kind of quiet that follows after something sacred. The audience didn't clap right away, not out of confusion but reverence. Then a single pair of hands came together, then more, a standing ovation not because Ethan was perfect, but because he was present. Ethan looked out and saw faces he had once hidden from. He didn't hide now. Isabella squeezed his hand. Alexander walked forward, bent down, and whispered something only Ethan heard. "You brought her back, just for a moment. Thank you." Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes were bright, his heart open, and the house, for the first time in a very long time, felt whole. The applause had faded, but the silence that followed felt louder than before. The guests left slowly, reluctantly. Some lingered by the doorway, touching Ethan's shoulder, whispering praise. A few hugged Alexander. One woman simply took Isabella's hand and held it for a moment, wordless, her eyes shining. and then the house was quiet again. The sunroom still smelled of lavender. The sheet music lay untouched on the stand. Ethan sat in his chair, staring at the keys, not playing, just sitting. Alexander entered with 2 cups of cocoa. He handed one to Ethan and sat beside him. "How do you feel?" Alexander asked. Ethan took a sip. The warmth surprised him. "Empty," he said honestly. "But in a good way. Like I'd left something out there, and I'm not sure I'd want it back." Alexander nodded slowly. "That's what giving yourself to something feels like." Ethan looked at him. "Is that what you do at work?" Alexander smiled faintly. "Not always, but I'd like to start." There was a pause. Then Ethan asked, "Will she stay?" Alexander knew who he meant. He didn't answer. Isabella stood in the kitchen, folding the program in half, then in half again, then again until it was a small square in her palm. A keepsake? Or a goodbye? She had planned to leave, even before the recital. There was a letter in her drawer, a recommendation from a friend in Chicago, a part-time position at a music school. Something safe, something small, something she could control. She'd written the email weeks ago, just hadn't sent it yet. When Alexander entered, she didn't turn. He stood in the doorway, unsure of how to begin. "I never said thank you," he said finally. She nodded. "You didn't have to." "But I want to." She folded the paper one more time, tighter now, almost vanishing into her hand. "I was going to leave," she said. He said nothing. "Not because I wanted to, but because I thought I was supposed to. Because healing is never meant to last. It's supposed to happen, then move on." Alexander walked in slowly. "What if it doesn't have to move on?" he asked. Isabella turned to face him. "What are you asking me?" Alexander took a breath. "I'm asking if you'd stay. Not as staff, not as obligation, but as family. Whatever that means now." Isabella looked at him, unsure whether to smile or cry. "That's not a small question," she said. "No," he agreed, "but nothing about what you've done here has been small." Later that night, Ethan found Isabella in the garden. The moon was high, washing the rosemary and lilies in silver. He wheeled himself to her, holding something in his hand, a page, the final bars of their song. He handed it to her. "I want you to have it," he said. "So no matter where you go, we are still playing together." Isabella looked at the page. Her name was written in the corner, for Isabella Reyes. She knelt beside him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Thank you," she whispered. "But I think I might stay a little longer." Ethan didn't smile, he beamed. Alexander stood at the window, watching them. For the first time, the house didn't feel haunted by memories. It felt filled with them, the good kind, the kind that stay. Spring came quietly. The garden, once brittle and sleeping, began to breathe again. Lavender bloomed first, stubborn and sweet. The lilies followed, stretching toward a sky that was no longer gray. Ethan played every morning now, not always the full piece. Sometimes just a phrase, a bar, a single note held longer than it needed to be, as if savoring it, as if remembering what it took to get there. Alexander no longer stood in the hallway. He sat in the sunroom beside Ethan. Sometimes he turned pages. Sometimes he played a single note at the end of a line, just to feel included. Sometimes he just listened. Isabella stayed. She didn't unpack everything right away. The suitcase remained half-zipped in the guest house for weeks, as if she wasn't quite ready to admit she belonged. But over time, a scarf appeared on the back of a chair, a book on the kitchen counter, a pair of old slippers tucked neatly beside the door. She planted new herbs, not for cooking, just for growing. One morning, Ethan asked a question he hadn't asked in a long time. "Do you think I could play in front of more people someday?" Alexander looked up from his coffee. "You mean a recital?" Ethan shook his head. "Bigger. A concert. A real stage." Isabella raised an eyebrow, a playful challenge in her smile. "Are you saying you're ready for Carnegie Hall?" Ethan grinned. "Maybe not yet, but someday." Alexander leaned forward. If that's what you want, we'll make it happen. Ethan hesitated. Would you come with me? Alexander didn't blink. Every step. Isabella placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. You'll never be alone on that stage. The room fell quiet, not empty, full. The song they wrote stayed on the piano. It was never framed, never published. It didn't need to be. It belonged to them. They played it often, not always perfectly, but always together. Sometimes just the first movement, sometimes the end. But always, when the last note rang out, they let it linger, held it, let it fade slowly. Because they knew some notes don't disappear. They stay in the hands that played them, in the rooms that heard them, in the hearts that needed them. And that was enough. More than enough.